Good afternoon. Good afternoon to all. Today about climate change. The first debate was on geopolitics. To some extent, it is very important where we are today in the post-COVID crisis. And the first debate was about how the EU finds itself between the United States and China. The second debate was also of relevance to what we are going to discuss today. It dealt with what is the role of the market and what is the role of public support and governmental policies in dealing with the COVID crisis. Today, we are dealing with climate change. Next week, we are going to deal with the digital economy. So on climate change, we had, in fact, a quite busy decade behind us. And in the middle of the decade, we had the Paris Agreement. 2015, we adopted the Paris Agreement and all countries were asked to come with their policy programs. And these policy programs would be up for review this year at COP26, the next governmental negotiation in Glasgow. But that has now been, because of the COVID, postponed with 1 year until November of next year. But the Paris Agreement is going to be a very important context, and in particular, the policy programs that we are adopting in the context of that. The second element is in Europe. The European institutions adopted the Green Deal agenda. And this Green Deal is now in the middle of a strategic discussion. We are in the middle of a discussion on the budget, and the budget is going to determine to what extent we pursue the Green Deal as was intended at the original start. And the third element is the international agenda, international cooperation. Where are we going with multilateralism? Because there is a big question about the place of the EU in the world, but there is also worrying signs coming from across the Atlantic. For example, President Trump has announced to leave the Paris Agreement as the first big nation, the first nation de facto to leave the Paris Agreement. And so that level of cooperation is going to be under pressure and should be part of our debate today. So I look forward for a great discussion today. Let me introduce the panelists. Of course, myself, I'm Jos Delbeke. I'm the professor for climate action at the School of Transnational Governments at the EUI in Florence and the KU Leuven. And formerly, I was the Director General for Climate Action at the European Commission. I have the pleasure of having as a panelist Professor Harald Winkler. Harald has been and is belonging and teaching at University of Cape Town. He is an authority on climate change and energy issues, not only for South Africa, but also for Africa, and is a very respected voice globally because he participated in on many instances in the negotiations at the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So thank you very much, Harald, for joining us from Cape Town. And the other panelist is Dr. Brigitte Knopf. She is the Secretary General of the Mercator Research Institute on the Global Commons and Climate Change, based in Berlin. And Brigitte is going to bring to us the German perspective, but Germany is becoming, in just a couple of weeks from now, the president of the EU. And I think that that EU perspective and where is the future with the Green Deal, the budget and things is going to be very important. So Brigitte, also very much welcome. I think we have an excellent duo because the intention is not only dig into the issues related to Europe, but link to that how the world is looking at us and how we should be looking at the world in terms of international cooperation. We will also be joined by Peter Vis, who is a senior advisor at Ruud Peterson, a consultancy company in Brussels, and part-time researcher at the EUI in Florence. Peter was the former head of cabinet of Connie Hedegaard, and Peter will have an eye on the questions. And so this is an open debate. We invite all of you to put forward the questions, and Peter is going to have an eye on the questions, structure them according to 3 themes. And that is what I would like the panelists to structure their debate around. 3 themes, which I think is the frame of our debate today. The first is, we know that COVID-19 and the lockdown policies led to quite dramatic economic recession, or a standstill even in much of the economy. Now, the good point is that the greenhouse gas emissions related to that were going down. But how long will that last is the first question. How is the impact of the COVID-19 crisis going to have a lasting impact on our greenhouse gas emissions? The second question to the panelists is the policy response. The policy response in different countries, in South Africa, in Germany, in the EU. What should we expect? Because we are facing, all of us, up to a big recession. Even people would start talking about a depression. So how are we going to deal with this policy response in different countries? And the third question is the policy response in terms of international cooperation. There is now a new reality. We have a new reality on international finance. We have a new reality on international trade. We have the IMF, the World Bank, all the international institutions really looking at new ways to revitalize the world economy. And so how are we looking into that from a climate perspective? So that's the third question. So, as I said, we have 2 main speakers, and perhaps may I invite Brigitte to introduce the German/European perspective. And then I will invite Harald to add on the perspective seen from South Africa. And why South Africa? I think South Africa is an important country, but it is not too small, it's not too big, it's not too poor, it's not too rich. And it is an important partner to Europe, has historically very strong ties to Europe. So what happens in South Africa, I think, is a very good temperature, a very good standard of how the other parts of the world may look at us. For once, let's not go into the major questions about China or India, etc. I mean, we are very determined to look into cooperation with Africa. And I think that's why the South African perspective and the perspective of Harald is going to be of importance to us. So let me open the debate in having the floor given to you, Brigitte. Will you start in introducing, I think you introduced some slides, you prepared some slides. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Jos, for this introduction. And I hope you can see my slides now, otherwise please interrupt. Yeah. So I will start first with a question you posed. So what is actually the effect of the lockdown on global emissions? And it's quite interesting to see that 1 week ago, Corinne Lecqueret and some colleagues, also a colleague from MCC, they have provided a first analysis of the effects of the lockdown on global emissions. And on the left-hand side, you can see the global daily fossil fuel emissions. And we see that they dropped by 17%. So really a huge effect of this lockdown. It was mainly the highest effect was early April. And on the right-hand side, you can see that it's mainly due to the surface transport. So surface transport accounts for the largest share of this drop in emissions. That's different from country to country, but here surface transport, so car travel or travel in public transport, that has decreased considerably. Of course, you mentioned it before, so it's not entirely a good news because we reduce emissions, but at a very expensive costs because the cost of a global recession. But at least to show you the magnitude of that. Overall, they calculated that emissions will drop by about 4 to 7%, depending on how long the lockdown will last. And even that would not be enough to reach 1.5, the 1.5 degrees target. So we would need 10 years of Corona crisis to reduce emissions when we only do it by these demand side measures. And this is already a sign that we really need structural change. So the next point is, or the important point is, when we look at past crises, so you see that the black line are again the global yearly emissions. And when we look at past crises, you see that we always see a slight drop in emissions, but then emissions went to the actual path again and grew and grew further. And also the global financial crisis that most of you will remember, 2008 and 2009. So emissions have dropped slightly for 1 year, but then came back again on the same path. So this points out that it really needs structural change to make a real change and to really have sustained reduced emissions. And how can we do this? And this is actually the most important part now that should be discussed, I think. And the first question is, what can we learn from these past crises? So what went wrong after, for example, the financial crisis? And just to put 3 points here on the table. So the first one is badly designed policies. This was the case in Germany, where we had a so-called cash for clunkers program for the car industry, but it had a very strong adverse environmental effect. So that's one item. Another one is on implementation. So in the US, there had been renewable investments that had a beneficial effect, but it lacked a kind of overall complementary measures, like, for example, carbon pricing, to make this effect bigger and more lasting into the future. And then we've also seen a lot of greenwashing, for example, in South Korea. The river dams or railroads have been built, and of course not everybody would call that green. So this is what we learned from past experience, and now to look forward and to pose the question, what is likely to last, and what may soon be disappear, and how can we shape the future. I've just put some points here to show that we have kind of a strong polarization of scenarios for the future. So on the one hand, we could have more home office work with less traffic then, or more webinars like we have now. So I'm not in Florence, but we meet in these webinars. So this is one direction the future could go. Or the other future is that we have a continued trend of increasing air travel, as we have seen before. So perhaps not in the next 1 or 2 years, but then it could go up again. Another alternative future is, this is a picture on the left-hand side at the bottom from Berlin. So we have many pop-up bike lanes. We see this in many capitals, so Berlin, London, Paris, and many more probably over the world. So pop-up bike lanes to change the city mobility. On the other hand, we might see more car travel. So because for safety reasons, due to the coronavirus, people might switch again to private cars and not use public transport. So these are different futures. And a third very important aspect also for the climate is what will happen with coal. Also here, very distinct futures are possible. So on the one hand, you see from the Guardian title, coal industry will never recover after Corona's pandemic. So that might be one direction, so directly switching towards renewables. But on the other hand, we also see that, for example, China has now put even more coal in the coal pipeline. So we might see in China and other Asian countries a glut of new coal-fired power stations. They're called the brown elephants. So again, a strong polarization of the scenarios for the future. And my last slide is, these are distinct futures and very different futures that are ahead of us, but we can shape them, or at least our governments can shape them, and they can be shaped by policies. And what is important when we think of recovery programs? So it will be important to watch whether these stimulus packages and recovery programs that we will see in the next weeks and months to come, do they focus on the 3T or the 4T approach? So the 3T approach is timely, targeted, and temporary for stimulus packages. And then the question is, will they also be transformative? So I have the fourth T in it. And just to give you two examples here, the EU recovery package was introduced last Wednesday, here by Ursula von der Leyen and the Commission. And the question is it really green? So I have some doubts. It's not that progressive as one could expect. So let's see how this develops. And we have the discussion currently in Germany. So tomorrow, Germany's cabinet will decide on the recovery program and the stimulus package. We have had a very lively debate over the last weeks with many new proposals on the table, ranging from NGOs and think tanks, but also conservative economists proposing recovery packages where climate is also at least a part, if not a center, of these stimulus packages. However, it's not quite clear how the government will decide, because 2 points are most controversial. So the purchase premiums for cars, this is still under debate, whether all cars should get a purchase premium or just electromobility. So let's see how the results will look like tomorrow. And then we had a debate on the rescue plan for the Lufthansa, whether so the German airline, whether this is just, in a sense, just the government supporting it, or having green strings attached, as for Air France, where, for example, short distance travel should be replaced by train travel and not by air travel. Yes, so that's it. And again, I think we can shape the future, and these stimulus packages are very important, and they will shape the next decade of what is ahead of us in terms of emissions. So thank you. That's from my side.
Thank you very much, Brigitte, and thank you very much to underline how much the political decision-making has discretion over what is going to happen over the coming decade. I think that's a very important one. Without any firm decision, we are going to miss the opportunity, like we missed it, presumably, after the banking crisis, where we saw that things were business as usual, and that we missed an opportunity. So that's very important. And the second point you are strongly underlining is coal. Now, Harald, coal is, of course, very important in South Africa. You have a power sector that is very dependent on coal. You have lots of coal mining activity. So the structure of the economy in South Africa is somewhat different from what we have in Europe. And so can you enlighten us how you see the COVID crisis and the policy that should be taken out of that?
Sure. Thank you, Jos. And it's a pleasure to be with everyone here. So I hope my slides can be shown. Fiona, thank you very much. So if we can just go to the next one, just to start off, the debate in South Africa is not currently about a green stimulus. We're very much looking at a red rescue and recovery package, and I would certainly be amongst those saying we must green that package. But I just wanted to show two pictures here of the country that we are in. Two pictures of queues. And in 1994, the first democratic election in South Africa, a wonderful day, and people stood patiently in the sun for hours and hours to the first time cast their vote. Now we are seeing people queuing because they're hungry. And long queues, and so this is the very sort of immediate present reality, and why it is the case that really and I'll come back to this, the focus is very much on the socioeconomic implications. So can I have the next slide, please? I think it's also important, and I think this is important for South Africa and for Europe and indeed the world, is that when we're looking at the policy packages that are going to respond to this, we need to understand that we live in a very unequal world. So you spoke earlier of South Africa being kind of not too big, not too small, but really former President Thabo Mbeki talked about two economies. I don't live very differently, I don't think, than you, Jos, but there are other South Africans who live very differently. And what this graph from Branko Milanovic shows is that is basically dividing the world population up into ventiles, groups of 5%. And what was true based on UN statistics, this was in 2012, but this pattern is still true, is that the richest 5% of Indians, who we sometimes think about, earn the same as the poorest 5% of Americans. So we still have, the world is no longer divided into two groups of countries, but it is not homogenous by a long shot. We have inequality. South Africa being, unfortunately, topping the list of the Gini coefficient rankings, but also internationally. And COVID is really exacerbating inequality. And I think that's important as we come to this question. Can I have the next slide, please? So, of course, COVID is particularly a health crisis, but it has a huge impact in terms of debt and the macroeconomic impact, I think, in developing countries. Why we are focusing on, including in South Africa, on the socioeconomic recovery, is that flattening the epidemic curve actually worsens GDP. So I've taken this from a presentation from Ricardo Hausmann, who is showing, if you look at the red lines, of course, that's a very steep curve, and we aim to flatten in the top half of the diagram. We aim to flatten the curve. That's what we're all talking about. But in fact, and this is, the red line in health effects has a less severe socioeconomic impact, other things being equal, unless we spend and of course, other things are never equal. But what is important to say is that in this space, it's really important to understand who has fiscal space and who does not have fiscal space. And South Africa is certainly in the group of countries. Even before the crisis started, we did not have fiscal space. The sovereign debt guarantees to our coal-fired electricity utility, Eskom, were already putting our entire fiscal framework at risk. Treasury no longer able to extend sovereign debt guarantees. So, and this is just getting worse. Next slide, please. Here I just briefly want to touch on one of the particular questions that you raised, and that, Brigitte, you also spoke about Lufthansa. Well, SAA is doing even much worse than Lufthansa, was also actually already under business rescue. But I thought this was really fascinating, and wonder if some of the people watching would come back to this. This was an analysis trying to show which policies would have long-run, this is Cameron Hepburn and others from Oxford, long-run multipliers, and a high positive or high negative impact on the other axis. And the little one that I've put, the only thing I've added is the red arrow, but the E, which you probably can't read, are airline bailouts. So the idea that you bail out SAA is clearly a bad idea. I would personally agree, but there's a big debate and there's a real holding on to this. But it's the one thing that really doesn't give you big socioeconomic multipliers, while Brigitte, you were showing the reductions due to COVID, but they'll pick up again if the air travel picks up again. Can I have the next one, please? So now I want to go back to South Africa and the bigger socioeconomic picture. These are tables, and the detail doesn't matter so much, but really what I've done is highlight. This is the current rescue package. So a country like South Africa, with no fiscal space, essentially is going to be borrowing. I think all countries in the world are going to be more indebted than they were before the crisis, but South Africa and other countries, I think, are going to need debt relief as well. And so all the interventions on the left-hand side of this table are all red interventions in terms of health, to save people. By red, I mean socioeconomic, municipal support, social grants, job support, and so on. And that's, I've converted this into euro. We talk about half a trillion South African rand. That's, for us, is a big number, but it's about 25 billion euro, and that's very likely not to be enough. And the green on the right-hand side here, unfortunately, is not green as in environmental terms, but essentially where we will be borrowing. And very large parts of this will be borrowing. So there's some reprioritization of the domestic budget that can be done. But really, we're going to be borrowing about 295 out of the 500 billion. And that means we will have to pay it back. And I think the issues of debt and debt relief and how that plays into international climate finance are very important for this discussion. Can I have the next slide, please? So here's the one idea that has been floating around in South Africa sometime before the COVID crisis hit us. And it's the idea of a just transition transaction. So we're all talking about a just transition increasingly in many countries, and including this Asia Declaration. It came actually out of the ILO and the labor movement, but in climate, in Katowice in Poland, also a very an area with a lot of coal, there was a declaration supporting a just transition away from coal and towards more renewables. And it's not only our electricity sector that's dominated by coal, we also produce 30% of our liquid fuel from coal. So the idea of the transaction in simple terms is that essentially we don't no longer need international climate finance to pay for renewables, particularly wind and solar photovoltaics are now cheaper in South Africa than new coal. That is funded by the private sector, and not CSP, not other technologies, but those ones. But what is not happening is that we're getting is to phase out coal more rapidly. And the idea is, historically, climate finance has flowed towards the good stuff, if you want, renewables, energy efficiency, other low carbon technologies. But we actually need to apply climate finance to accelerate the phase out of coal. And what we've got there are two lines. The blue line is basically what would happen anyway. Always a baseline question, always many questions about that. Already in our official electricity plan, there is decommissioning of coal. But if you actually took concessional finance out of international climate finance and reduced more emissions, you would have directly reduced emissions by the fact that there's less coal operating, and you would be creating more space for the renewables, which are happening anyway, to take up that space. But what is critical to this story, given the context that I've tried to paint before, is that that concessional component flows into a just transition fund, and the idea of that just transition fund, it would be a reliable and predictable source of income to basically fund development projects in a province in South Africa called Mpumalanga. It's east of Johannesburg, and it has all the problems of South Africa: extreme poverty, the coal basin, a whole lot of other problems, but to really make the transition in that place. And yeah, I think that is something that is worth thinking about. And I think I have one or two more slides, but I should be almost done. I just wanted to show briefly, if we think, just again, this is back to the inequality. Let me go to the next one that I really wanted to go to. Yeah, so this is really the last point that I wanted to make, Joss, which is that I think a lot of this analysis that we're doing, and I think both Brigitte and I have shown some graphs and some analysis, some numbers, but at the end of the day, I think this also comes down to a social contract amongst people. And those of us, this is a very simple graph, simplistic graph even of income against greenhouse gas emissions, but the right-hand little graph is the rich, and the contract here is that the rich need to learn how to live well with less. And the little black box there is very, very many people who actually need to be lifted out of poverty. Certainly in South Africa, lifting poor people out of poverty does not blow our emissions budget. The problem is the consumption of the relatively affluent people like me and other South Africans like me. And it's also critically that middle kind of roundish shape, the aspirations of the middle class, that's also really important. If everybody who's so-called middle class in South Africa wants to live like the rich, or even worse, like rich Americans, very large household, then we do have a problem. And so that is the social contract that I think is important in South Africa. And my final comment is that I think that this crisis also confronts us with deep ethical questions, not just economic ones, which is, do we choose economically to look after ourselves, economic nationalism at the international, or is there solidarity at the global level between Europe and South Africa, between, multilaterally, as you said, very important, or does everybody basically retreat into their own fortress? So I think we need to think about all of these questions, climate and the socioeconomic implications from an economic and an ethical perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Harald. I think you're really putting an additional perspective to the debate that we are currently having in Europe. But I take from your intervention what you stressed at the beginning, that COVID-19 is exacerbating inequality. I think that is something that, given the numbers we are talking about, unemployment rates are very high compared to what we see in Europe, even if they are considered to be very high in Europe. I think that this exacerbation of inequality is an important one. Also, your stress that the fiscal space is very limited, and hence that borrowing, debts and debt relief is a very important issue coming up. That's another perspective that we are internally discussing in Europe. You may know that we have a green deal that needs to be translated into the budget, and so cooperation between member states that are hardly hit through COVID crisis with those, or cooperation with those that are less hard hit, is a major issue on the future budget. But I see also agreements about what you have been bringing forward. I think on aviation, I think you made very similar comments, whether you are talking South African Airlines or Lufthansa. I think that's a point well taken. And you also, both of you, underline very much the dimension of just transition. I think that's also in Europe coming up as a big thing. Even if you have, Harald, a little bit of a different interpretation compared to what we have in Europe, which is the phasing out of coal, which is also an important issue in Europe, but it is not so determinant. You know, it's an important element in some countries, but overall, I think that the phasing out of acceleration of phase out of coal in South Africa is an important one. So I see lots of questions have been coming our way, and I'm turning in a minute to Peter to perhaps address the first part. We saw, in any case, some hopeful elements. The emissions of greenhouse gases are going down, even temporarily, perhaps even more structurally because of the webinars, the home offices, etc., the bikes that are coming up in all capitals in Europe. You have more questions, Peter, coming up on those positive elements that may come from the lockdown experience we all were going through.
Well, there is a relevant question from Roberto Breitman, who's basically asking whether the pent-up demand is going to lead to more pollution than would otherwise happen in the second and third quarters of this year as confinement and lockdown measures are lifted. You know, people have still had cars that have broken down and they want to replace them. So there's certain demand that has not been met, could not be met because of the shutdown. And would there not be the risk of a very quickly rising emissions as that pent-up demand is met? That's the fear. And he wonders what can be done to try and reduce this pressure.
Brigitte, is that an issue in Germany? In the debate, because the government is about to decide tomorrow, and there is a stormy debate, you know, preceding that set of decisions. Is that one of the elements?
The demand question is not that much on the center, but I would agree with the person who asked that question that after the lockdown is open in a sense, so then of course people will buy again what they didn't buy before. I think there will still be some structural issues, like for example with airplanes and so on. I think for the next 1 or 2 years we will see less holiday planes and so on that might last for a longer time. In Germany, the debate is very much about investments. So which kind of investments should be done? And so here we have really, for example, in investing in electromobility and infrastructure for electromobility and so on. But on the other hand, already last year we had in Germany a big debate, and a full climate package was already agreed on last year. And what's quite positive, 2 weeks ago, the government decided to keep track with that, right? Not to abandon these decisions, but especially increasing the carbon price for the transport and the heating sector. And I think this is a very important signal, because if we want to, or if new investments are being stimulated, then we need a carbon price to steer these investments into the right direction. And this is currently being debated, but not so much on the demand side. But again, I think the most important point is the car industry. They are quite strong in Germany, and I don't expect too many good news tomorrow concerning this issue.
Okay. Turning to you, Harald. Any thoughts on this greening of packages, because you have a carbon tax? And if I take the carbon pricing element that Brigitte is bringing forward, was it not put on hold, or is it just temporary? And how do you see it developing?
I think as I said in the beginning, Joss, I think the sort of discussions on greening are for us mainly still some time off. I think the immediate priorities are different, but yes, you are correct. So we do have a carbon tax, and we've got that established in law since 2019 at what I think is a relatively low rate, but bringing the price into the system. And there is a 3-month holiday on payments of that. Now, that's not the carbon tax hasn't been singled out in that regard. There have been several areas where companies have been given some relief. So far, I have not seen any signal that would become. I mean, when I heard that, frankly, I was a little bit concerned myself. Would this become a precedent? But I have not seen that. In fact, the opposite. There was one of the senior officials in our National Treasury indicated that after 2022, which is until when the carbon price is set and increasing by a little bit above inflation, that a significantly higher carbon price could be contemplated. So to say that even at this time is quite bold, actually, in the South African debate.
Okay, we are moving slightly into the policy space. I'm sure, Peter, there are lots of questions related to that. What do you read?
Well, yes, I give 2 questions. One, they are in general being directed to either Brigitte or Harald. But one of them to Brigitte was that the EU recovery program, on your slide, you said, is it really green? And the person asking that question said, well, why should you doubt that? So that was Monty who's asked that particular question. And then there is another one, which is about the South Africa and the phasing. Well, is there any comparability between the coal phase out in Germany and whatever the South Africans might think of doing to coal? I mean, they're very different countries, of course, but that is a question that has been asked as well.
May I answer to you, Brigitte? There is the no harm principle that was advanced by the European Commission. No investment should be made that goes against the objectives of the Green Deal. Do I read in what you have been saying that that is not considered to be strong enough?
Exactly. This is my point. I mean, it sounds really good. It's perhaps more like a buzzword, right? So because how to control for that, not doing harm, what does it mean? So we have seen after the financial crisis that some of the recovery packages had this greenwashing in it. And how to prevent a kind of greenwashing, how to control that countries who take the credits from the EU. I mean, this is a really huge program and very good program, very important also for the future of the EU as such. But how to control that this is really not doing any harm? Do they want to do this project by project or whatever? So again, so you mentioned my boss, Ottmar Edenhofer. He had the idea of inducing a kind of shadow price on credits, on implicit price for the credits, a carbon price. And that, again, would allow you to not to do it on a project by project base, but when you get the credit, you get it for cheaper conditions when you invest into renewables, for example. So this is one point, and the other point is that there was a leaked document where many more projects were in it, and actually, I didn't see it being published. So perhaps it will come out later or so with some new elements in it and more concrete proposals what the EU can do, for example, investing into renewables. But again, here, so they mentioned hydrogen as a strategy, but we know it depends on the color, whether it's green or blue or which kind of hydrogen. And the EU didn't propose a new instrument. So they could have taken that opportunity to propose a new instrument or enlarge carbon pricing also to other sectors, for example. There's only one element in it that is quite interesting, that is concentrating on the revenues or having additional money for the EU's budget from revenues from carbon pricing and from border carbon adjustments. But as a whole, it might develop in the right direction, but how to control for that? And yeah, I think this is why I'm a bit skeptical about the package, whether it's really green.
If I may have a follow-up question to what you just said, and in particular the proposal by Edenhofer, is that an implicit carbon pricing he would propose for the entire European budget, or would it be a separate fund or a vehicle that he would be proposing? Because that matters a lot when it comes to the overall package that is now huge. That is going to be managed to quite a large extent by the European Investment Bank, that also have strong principles for greening, etc., etc. Would it be general or a specific fund?
Probably not general. It would be a specific fund, and it could be applied either to Europe, but also think of the international dimension. So we have heard Harald with coal, or also some other Asian countries. So, for example, Vietnam or other countries could borrow money, and when they invest into renewables, they get cheaper credit. So it could also be a kind of international program that would apply. So therefore, I think it's an interesting direction to think of.
Very good. Now that turns to you, Harald. You mentioned the coal question and the accelerated phase out of coal. Mm-hmm. Would the money that would come from such a fund go to the private companies, or where would that money go? Because I mean, public opinion in Europe would say, hang on, we have a coal question still inside Europe, and now we are going to subsidize coal somewhere else in the world. You see the politics related to coal. How would you see that?
Yeah. So that is what the transaction is not doing. But I mean, it's a common question. And that's where really we're starting to think about international climate finance in a different way. So, I mean, there have been World Bank loans to coal-fired power stations, but this transaction would accelerate the phase out of coal, would be financing. And the way that would work, or is being developed, is it's blended financing. So there'd be a component of, there'd be an international concessional loans, so below the usual rate, and it would be climate finance because it's taking coal away, not putting it in. But also very much, I think about 2/3 or so would be domestic commercial loans. It would go not directly to Eskom. Eskom is our national utility. More than 90% of its electricity comes from coal, for two reasons. One is not putting it directly in. It creates that impression that you're putting it directly in the coal, which is not the idea. But also that Eskom has as I mentioned in the beginning, is basically has a big problem in terms of an existing debt problem. 450 billion, another 20-odd billion euros of debt before the crisis. And so it would go into a vehicle that would on-lend this finance to Eskom, and that also then gives some degree of governance from Treasury and one of our ministries, public enterprises. What's important to me to add is also the concessional components. So say, I'm making up numbers now, don't quote me on these numbers, right? Say you can get, the real rate of return is 6%, and you're getting it for 3%. So you're getting 3 percentage points less. That concessional component would flow into this Just Transition Fund, and that would fund, as I said, development projects in Mpumalanga, for example, a very poor region. And Just, we've talked about this before. One of your fellow countrymen, Frans Timmermans, was here, and there was a discussion with some very energetic youth activists, and he said that he comes from a coal region. And one thing that really stayed in my head in the Netherlands is that it took decades, until the Netherlands benefited, but there were certain regions, and including where I think his family came from, it took, I think he said, 30 years until those regions got back to being somewhere, where they were. And in any transitions, persuading the winners is easy, right? You've got to take along the losers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Brigitte, on coal, Germany has a story to tell, no?
Yes, exactly. So actually, Germany is still a coal country, but last year we have decided to phase out coal by 2038. It sounds very long, but it's really Germany builds heavily on coal. There are some components in this coal phase-out plan that are important and interesting, and perhaps also interesting in comparison to South Africa, because this was one of the questions in the chat. So there is a huge component of a just transition, right? So large share of the money, I think 40 billion, goes to coal regions to build up something new, to compensate workers and so on. So there was a big debate on how to manage a just transition. And also the trade unions have been very strong in that debate. So this is one important component. And I think most people say, yes, that's important and we need that. The other component is huge compensation schemes for the power plant providers. And this is very controversial, especially now as coal use drops, because we have a higher price in Europe, we have less demand. The coal use drops, but still the power plant providers ask for high compensation. And this is really, I'm not sure how this will develop. It's postponed in the legislation again and again. So let's see if we have a longer drop in emissions or drop in coal. Let's see whether they will get their compensation. And it's also quite interesting because there was a question in the chat about what can we do, social movement. So on Saturday, a new power plant in Germany got on the grid. And this is somehow crazy, right? You cannot tell this to the people. And we have a strong Fridays for Future movement in Germany, and they went on the streets and said, how can this happen? How dare you, right? And you put a new power plant on the grid. And so coal is still a debate in Germany, and will last for another month and so on. And I think it's probably not a blueprint, right? Not for other countries, because a lot of money is being given to compensation and so on. But the aspect of the just transition, this is important, and I think this should be part of every coal phase-out plan.
Okay, but that's a very good conclusion indeed. It's a very expensive plan, but at the same time, the social context is very local. It's different even in every region of Europe. You cannot generalize those questions. Peter, you have been following more questions, and on international cooperation, we are already dwelling a little bit into that. But I mean, you may have picked up other questions, Peter.
Well, really, the questions that are coming are about multilateralism, and I would just say this. Put simply, the question is, after the COVID crisis, is multilateralism going to be strengthened, or is it going to be weakened? This is a crisis. COVID is a particular health crisis, a very tragic one with economic consequences. Climate change is also a crisis, which will have many consequences, including economic ones. Is multilateralism being strengthened by what we're living through now? That is really the question that's been.
And can I build on this question that Peter is advancing towards the international negotiations and COP26? We will now have more preparation time. We will know what comes out of the elections in the United States, which was otherwise a major unknown factor for November of this year, apart from the COVID crisis. So how can we have hopes, or should we rethink a number of things when it comes to multilateral negotiations? Harald, shall we start with you? Because you were quite involved in defining the South African positions, and we worked very well together in the past on those questions. But now we face up to a new reality. How would you see this?
Well, just I think you and I, we strongly support multilateralism, and the South African government, as a matter of foreign policy, does take that approach to how we should do things. But it is a should statement. I think the one, I don't know. I mean, I don't think any of us know how the future is going to unfold. But the one thing that the corona crisis, in a way, it forces us to work together, really to beat this short-term, relative to climate, short-term challenge. We've got to work together, and yet, we're seeing important countries, not to mince the words, in the United States particularly, but not only the US, and the Bolsonaro administration in Brazil as well, right? At least at the central government level. But particularly the US very strongly attacking the WHO and in that regard. And so it comes back to something that I said earlier. I think whether the answer to the question is a typical academic question, it depends. The typical academic answer depends. Yeah. But it depends, I think, on which choice we make. I think if we make the choice for solidarity, the word that I would use is, within Europe, within South Africa, between Europe and South Africa, across the world, then yes, we can come out of this with more stronger multilateralism than before. But if we all retreat into just looking after ourselves, then it could very significantly undermine how, and we might end up doing climate policy through trade wars behind barriers, right? And that's so I think there is a dismal scenario, unfortunately. There is a hopeful one.
Yeah, Brigitte.
Yeah, I would agree with Harald. Just to put in a different or an additional perspective. So, in the Corona crisis, I think in the end, Harald just said we need global cooperation. But I would say in the Corona crisis, every country followed their own strategy, and you can do your own strategy and be better off than all other countries, right? So Germany had really good luck to do this, and so therefore we are better off than other countries, for example. The climate crisis is different because for the climate crisis we definitely need international cooperation. So therefore I think the climate crisis is even a little bit harder and needs more global cooperation. So there's no choice for us. We have to continue with that. It's very hard that the climate conference, the COP26, is postponed for another year, really a full year. So we have to keep momentum and we have to think about how to do this. Where I would fully agree is that we need solidarity. And so therefore that Merkel and Macron, that they proposed this budget idea, I think that was a strong sign for European solidarity. Also, this green or the proposal by Ursula von der Leyen and the Commission, that's also a kind of solidarity, this 50 billion recovery fund, and we need more of that. And what is perhaps missing is the international perspective. And because you asked about the German presidency, so they wanted, and I think they still want, the EU-China summit. That's a very important point, EU-China summit in September. Perhaps it will be just virtual, but this is an important step and milestone for them. And also there will be a European-African summit. So Harald, perhaps you know more about that, but I think it was supposed to be in October or November. And this shows perhaps starting from a strong Europe and then build international cooperation. I think that would be an important sign.
I would agree to that. And the EU-China summit, let's not forget that China is rolling out a carbon pricing system. They know their difficulties, like we had them in Europe, and like everybody who is entering in that space meets the problems that are inherent to that. It's not simple, but the fact that they are doing it and that it is not too different from what we are doing in Europe could be, reinforced also at the EU-China summit. There is a good debate that has taken shape there, and it could be reinforced. On the EU-African summit, Harald, I think also von der Leyen, the Commission President, has been making strong words that Africa is our priority for the future. Does that percolate through in South Africa? What are the hopes and the specific deliverables that you are looking at possibly in that space?
I think, I mean, it does come through. I don't have particular information about that summit other than, like, it's the timing and setting and so on uncertain is the little bits that I hear. But I think the issues that we've been discussing now, just transition, there are several African countries that have more recently than South Africa discovered fossil fuel. So this is just transition is not, I agree with something you said earlier, it's not just a coal issue, right? It's not just a fossil fuel issue even, it's also a land issue. So there's different dimensions.
Yeah.
And then just state the obvious that you will know, Joss, but perhaps some of us viewers won't. I think, of course, adaptation will be hugely important, and there we really also need to start thinking what is going to happen to issues like migration post-COVID, right? And so we had, of course, huge issues of migration, including in Europe and in Germany and many other countries, Italy and European countries. Right now, borders are closed. International air travel isn't happening. What is going to happen? But we know that out of the climate crisis will lead us, unfortunately, to a future with much more migration, and that is, and we know the social consequences. That will be, I can say with confidence, will be top of the African agenda.
Yeah, very, very much in agreement that adaptation is a very strong element in our common agenda, but so is the use of less coal and the use of more renewables. I think the market is helping us, and I think that needs to be accelerated. The percentages according to which South Africa is using coal are daunting. So I think that's a basic issue that needs to be addressed, as it is to be addressed, as Brigitte was saying. For China, you cannot build up more coal-fired power stations and still be serious about climate change. That's also our internal debate. So our leaders will have to explain whatever they decide on coal, that question is going to be there.
If I can add one phrase, Joss, that you reminded me of, not in South Africa, but many other countries in Africa, and they're different. A lot of the challenges about avoided emissions, not emission reductions, and that's also maybe important language to bring in. So the idea is, and this is a question for EU as well as China, right, with big investments in Africa, let's follow that lower carbon development path in the first way, but it has to be on the basis that people need to get energy access, affordable energy access, et cetera, right? On that basis, we don't need to let the emissions go high in order to reduce them later. That's the ideal, but that takes some doing.
Absolutely in agreement. And there, thanks God, the market is helping us. The price that was very high for renewables. And as far as I know, when I experience South Africa is a country with a lot of space, a lot of sun, a lot of wind. So the natural endowment is pretty good in South Africa. So I think that lots of businesses would look at South Africa opening up the market for this kind of new equipment. That is very promising for the future. Okay. Now I have a glimpse at the clock, and our time is almost up. Was there a burning last thought, Peter? If I try to summarize, I mean, according to the three themes that we have been discussing, I think on the first question, whether the impact of COVID-19 and the lockdown is going to be good for climate, yes, it is good in the short term, but it's going to be limited. It's going to be temporary, we are afraid. So that brings us immediately to the second theme. It all depends on the policies that are going to be embedded in the stimulus packages. And that matters to all nations in the world. That matters to the EU. It matters to South Africa. I think it will become clearer that it matters for all countries. And I would expect for COP26, that question is going to be on the table squarely, because as the crisis is being rolled out, we are all going to face up to a brutal reality that lots of changes need to be happening, but need to be financed, need to be stimulated, need to be incentivized. And so that's going to be a major one. An element we did not mention too much on carbon pricing is energy taxation, which is a very important one, alongside carbon taxation, energy taxation. And the third element on the international cooperation, we will need more of that. I think the just transition idea percolated very strongly through what Harald was making as arguments. Also, the question what to do with coal, how to deal with the people working in coal mining activities is going to be matter a lot, and what is the alternatives that can be generated through that. So these are all common questions. You know, we address them in Europe as much as you addressing them in South Africa, because you know, these are the common themes we are working on, even if the inequality challenge that Harald was mentioning at the beginning is really daunting. And we fully appreciate that. So let me thank you, all of you, Peter, Harald, Brigitte, for a very enriching debate. For the participants, I would like to announce that next Monday at 5 o'clock, we have another debate, and this time it's going to be about the digital economy. Professor Miguel Maduro is going to have a discussion with key players from all over the world. I learned a lot in this session. I enjoyed very much the cooperation of all of you, and I would like to thank all of you. And I would like to thank the participants for their questions. We are going to take good note of them, and see you next week. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, George.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.